There have been a lot of rumors about your love life. Did you meet anyone special in Germany?
Not any special one.
A CIA operative once assigned to Elvis Presley has finally released his private notes, and investigators are stunned by what they reveal. Hidden details about Elvis's life are now coming into the light, raising serious questions about what really happened behind the scenes. What did the CIA discover about Elvis? Why are investigators speechless today? Join us as we uncover the shocking truth: how Elvis Presley became America's most unlikely patriot. He was not the kind of man you would expect to carry secrets. Elvis Aaron Presley was loud where spies were quiet. He was generous when the intelligence world was cold. He laughed easily, cried openly, and pressed money into the hands of strangers he had never met and would never see again. People who knew him, really knew him, said he had a heart so wide open it was almost a problem. He could not pass a crying child without stopping. He could not eat a meal without worrying whether his friends had eaten too. He bought cars for people on a whim, not for attention, but because something inside him simply could not stand to see anyone go without. This was Elvis, a man who felt too much in a world that rarely felt enough. And yet, somewhere beneath all that warmth and glitter and gospel music, there was another side. A side that watched, a side that worried, a side that, according to documents long buried in the shadows of American intelligence, quietly made him one of the most unusual figures in the history of the CIA. Decades after Elvis passed away, on a hot August evening in 1977, a retired intelligence officer did something that no one expected. He unlocked a drawer that had been sealed for years and pulled out a collection of handwritten notes. These were not typed reports or official memos stamped with government seals. They were personal notes, careful, detailed, written in the steady hand of someone trained to observe without being observed. What those notes described shook everyone who read them. The documents revealed that a CIA operative had been assigned to monitor Elvis Presley during one of the most turbulent stretches of his life. But this was not routine surveillance. Governments had long kept files on famous people, musicians, actors, writers, usually out of vague political caution. This was different. The notes suggested national security concerns, real ones, the kind that made investigators sit up straight and read the pages twice. The handwriting alone told a story. It was precise, economical, every word chosen with purpose. This was not a bureaucrat filling out forms. This was a trained operative recording what he saw and heard with the discipline of someone who understood that details mattered. And the details were extraordinary. The notes described private meetings, conversations that never appeared in any newspaper or biography. Some took place at Graceland, Elvis's sprawling Memphis home, where the gates were always open to friends and the kitchen never went cold. Others happened quietly, arranged during tours, far from the bright lights and screaming crowds. In these meetings, Elvis apparently spoke freely. He talked about what he had seen growing up inside the American music world during the late 1960s and early 1970s, a period of enormous social upheaval when the country felt like it was pulling itself apart at the seams. He talked about people he had encountered, situations that made him uneasy, influences he believed were spreading through the entertainment industry, like something dark moving beneath clean water. He was afraid, not for himself. Those who knew Elvis well would tell you he rarely worried much about his own safety. He was afraid for the country he loved, with a fierceness that sometimes surprised people who only knew him from the stage. The operative wrote that Elvis believed deeply and sincerely that his celebrity gave him a vantage point that ordinary citizens simply did not have. He moved through rooms that most people never entered. He sat across from people who revealed things to him, casually, carelessly, because they assumed a rock and roll singer was too busy being famous to pay attention. They were wrong. What stunned the investigators who later reviewed these notes was a detail almost too remarkable to absorb. Elvis, it appeared, had known about the surveillance, and not only had he known, he may have cooperated, willingly, quietly, without anyone asking him to sign a form or take an oath. He simply cared that much. The operative described him as cooperative but unpredictable. That word, unpredictable, captures something true about Elvis that his closest friends always understood. He operated on feeling, He could be methodical one moment and wildly impulsive the next, moved by something invisible that only he could sense. He was not an easy man to manage or to categorize, but he was honest, almost painfully honest. He told the operative what he had seen. He named people, he described situations, and investigators reviewing the notes noticed something that stopped them cold. Some of the individuals Elvis mentioned were already known to intelligence agencies, already flagged, already being watched for reasons that had nothing to do with music. Elvis had crossed their paths without knowing what they were, or perhaps, by the end, knowing exactly what they were. He was a singer, a man who grew up poor in Tupelo, Mississippi, who once said that all he ever wanted was for people to be happy when they left his shows. He was not a politician or a soldier or a spy. He had no training in tradecraft, no background in intelligence work, no reason at all to be sitting in any room that mattered to the security of a nation. The secret patriot behind the sequined curtain. There are people in this world who are famous for what they do, and then there are people who are famous for who they are. Elvis Presley belonged to that second, rarer group. People who spent time around him, not the fans screaming from the crowd, but the ones who sat with him at a kitchen table or rode beside him in a car. They all said the same thing. He listened. Really listened. Not the way people pretend to listen while they wait for their turn to speak, but the way a person listens when they genuinely believe that what you are saying matters. He remembered names. He remembered birthdays. He remembered the small things people mentioned only once, in passing, and he brought them up weeks later as if he had been thinking about them ever since. He had grown up with very little, in a tiny house in Tupelo, Mississippi, where the walls were thin and the winters were cold and money was something the family talked about mostly in terms of what they did not have. That upbringing never left him. Even when he was the most famous man on earth, surrounded by every comfort imaginable, he still carried that boy from Tupelo, somewhere close to the surface. It showed in the way he treated people, in the way he gave, in the way he believed, without embarrassment or irony, that a person had a duty to serve something larger than themselves. That belief, as it turned out, would lead him somewhere no one expected. Among the handwritten notes recovered from a retired intelligence officer years after Elvis's death, one entry stood apart from the rest. It described a meeting in Washington, quiet, private, nothing that appeared on any official schedule, in which Elvis Presley said something that changed the entire shape of what followed. He told the operative he wanted to help, not in some vague, celebrity-making-a-gesture kind of way. He was specific. He had watched the dose culture spreading through America like a slow fire, creeping through neighborhoods and schools and concert halls, and it was burning him up inside. He had seen what it did to people, young people especially. He had watched them come to his shows full of light and energy and leave chasing something darker, something that would hollow them out from the inside if they let it. He felt it personally, the operative wrote, in the careful, restrained language of someone trained never to overstate. And that line, simple as it was, told investigators everything they needed to know about where Elvis's head was. This was not a celebrity making a public statement to look good. This was a man in a private room with no cameras and no applause saying, "I see what is happening and I want to do something about it." He believed that because of who he was, because of the rooms he could walk into, the people who trusted him, the world he moved through, he could help authorities understand how dangerous substances were making their way into entertainment circles in ways that ordinary investigators could never access. The operative recorded this, and the people who later read those records understood immediately that this was not a routine entry, because Elvis, it turned out, had already been watching. His notes, because in a sense they had become his notes too, through every conversation he fed into that careful intelligence file, described people he had encountered on tours and in recording sessions. Strange behavior, odd conversations, situations that scratched at something in the back of his mind and would not let go. He had a quality that the operative remarked on more than once, a sharp eye for detail that seemed at odds with the chaotic glamour of his public life. He mentioned names, described incidents, recalled conversations that others might have let slide past without a second thought. And here is where the notes became genuinely startling to everyone who reviewed them. Some of those names had already appeared in intelligence files. Some of those individuals were already being watched for reasons that had nothing to do with music, nothing to do with Elvis, and nothing to do with anything that should have intersected with the world of a rock and roll singer from Memphis. But there Elvis was, describing them, accurately, in detail. Having passed through their orbit without any official guidance, moved purely by instinct and the nagging sense that something was wrong. There was something else in those notes, something quieter and more personal. Elvis talked often about his time in the United States Army. He had served in the late 1960s, stationed in Germany, living in barracks like everyone else, refusing the special treatment his fame could easily have secured him. That decision had cost him professionally. Age 2 years away from the spotlight at the exact moment his career was at its peak. But he never seemed to regret it. The Operative recorded that Elvis spoke about that service with real pride. Not the showy, flag-waving kind. The quiet kind that lives in the chest and does not need an audience. And it was clear, reading between the lines of those notes, that the experience had shaped him in ways that went deeper than most people realized. He had learned what it meant to belong to something, to be part of a unit, to understand that some things mattered more than personal comfort or personal glory. He believed he could still serve. That was the word the Operative used more than once. Serve. Not perform, not appear, not lend his name, serve. He was frustrated, apparently, that people sometimes found it difficult to take him seriously when he spoke about the country and its problems. The image preceded him, the jumpsuits, the hair, the hysteria, and it was hard for some people to see past it to the man underneath, who had read voraciously, thought deeply, and carried genuine convictions about the world he lived in. He wanted to be more than a spectacle, more than a show. The question that hung over every page of those recovered notes, unresolved and electric, was exactly how far he had been allowed to go. If he was willing, and the evidence suggested he was, completely and without reservation, just how deep into that other world had Elvis Presley actually stepped? What Elvis carried, and when no one was looking. He was the kind of man who made a room feel warmer just by walking into it, not because he tried. That was the thing about Elvis Presley that people who met him in private always struggled to explain properly. The warmth was not a performance. It was not the carefully managed charm of someone who had been trained to work a crowd. It was simply him, unfiltered, unpolished, genuinely interested in the person standing in front of him. He would lean in when you talked. He would ask follow-up questions. He would laugh at your jokes even when they were not very good. And, somehow, it never felt condescending because the laugh was real and the eyes were kind. And you walked away feeling, strangely, like you had just made a friend you had known your whole life. He was also, beneath all of that sweetness, a man who paid attention. He noticed things, small things. The way someone's eyes moved when they answered a question. The way a conversation shifted when a certain name came up in a room. The sudden quiet that fell over a group of people when a particular subject was mentioned. He had grown up poor and watchful, in a world where reading people accurately was not a skill but a survival tool, and that instinct never left him, no matter how many years of fame and wealth and adulation stacked up around him. It was this combination, the open heart and the sharp eye, that made him, according to a collection of handwritten intelligence notes that surfaced decades after his death, one of the most genuinely surprising figures ever to brush against the edges of American intelligence work. And by the end of the file, something had changed in him, something that those who loved him might have recognized had they known what to look for. The investigators who stupissed away the Operative's notes described the experience as reading two documents at once. The main text told one story. The margins told another. Scattered throughout the pages, written in a slightly different hand, quicker, less careful, as though recorded in the moment rather than reconstructed later, were small observations that the Operative had clearly not intended as central to his report. They were asides, footnotes to the larger narrative, but to trained eyes, they were anything but minor. They described Elvis acting differently in certain situations, more guarded, more careful about who was nearby when he spoke. The Operative noted that Elvis occasionally requested private conversations, not the ordinary kind of privacy that any famous person might reasonably want, but a specific, deliberate kind. He would move away from windows. He would lower his voice in ways that had nothing to do with the sensitivity of the topic. He would pause mid-sentence and look around a room before continuing. This was a man who had begun to feel watched, not by the Operative, Not by intelligence officials whose involvement he had, according to earlier entries, apparently accepted and perhaps even welcomed. Something else. Something he could not name but could feel. The way you feel a change in weather before the clouds arrive. The tour entries made it worse. Several sections of the notes described incidents that occurred during Elvis's time on the road. That relentless circuit of cities and stages and hotel rooms that defined so much of his adult life. According to the Operative, Elvis had begun noticing people, unfamiliar faces appearing in places they had no obvious reason to be, backstage at concerts, in corridors that required special access, near restricted areas of hotels where the public wasn't supposed to reach. He mentioned these encounters. He described them in enough detail that the Operative took them seriously and quietly investigated several of the situations. Some resolved into nothing. Others did not resolve cleanly at all. The explanations were thin, the paper trail short, the individuals difficult to place with certainty. What troubled the investigators who later reviewed these sections was something specific. The behavior Elvis was describing, the patterns, the positioning, the way these unfamiliar figures seemed to appear and disappear without clear purpose, matched documented methods used by rival intelligence operations during that period, methods that had nothing to do with any American agency, methods that belonged to a different kind of surveillance entirely. The implications of that were uncomfortable to sit with. If those figures were what the pattern suggested they might be, then Elvis had not simply been moving through the ordinary world of music and fame. He had been moving, perhaps without fully understanding it, through something far more dangerous. And somewhere along the way, someone on the other side of a very different operation may have noticed him noticing. The final entries in the Operative's notes were the quietest, and in their quietness, they were the most affecting. The Operative wrote that Elvis had changed, not dramatically, not in the way that draws attention or invites questions, subtly. The way a light changes in a room when a cloud passes over the sun, he had become more withdrawn, more reflective. He spoke less about the issues that had once animated him so deeply, the concerns about dose culture and corrupted circles, and the slow erosion of things he believed in. Those conversations had been replaced by something softer: music, memory, the smaller details of a personal life. He was pulling inward, whether that was exhaustion or fear, or simply the accumulated weight of having seen and known things that a man with his kind of heart was perhaps never built to carry quietly, the notes did not say. The Operative was careful, professional, restrained. He recorded what he observed and did not speculate beyond the evidence. What he did record in the final pages was that the assignment was ending, that further monitoring had been deemed unnecessary, that the file, for all practical purposes, was being closed. But investigators who read those last entries found it difficult to accept that word, closed, at face value, because files end, assignments end. Operatives move on to other work and other names. People, though, carry what they have seen. Long after the watching stops, long after the notes are locked away, and the years begin to pass, the things a person has witnessed stay with them. On the way they move through a room, their eyes check a doorway before they speak, in the small, telling hesitations that those who love them notice but cannot explain. Elvis Presley passed away in August of 1977. The world mourned a performer, a legend, a voice that had changed everything. Very few people mourned what the margins of those notes quietly suggested. That somewhere inside that famous, generous, wide-open man, there had also lived someone who had seen too much and carried it alone, and never quite found a way to put it down. The man behind the myth. There are people who leave the world smaller than they found it, and then there are people whose absence, even decades later, leaves a shape in the air that nothing else quite fills. Elvis Aaron Presley was the second kind, those who knew him in the way that really counts, not from the front row of a concert hall or the glossy pages of a magazine, but from a dinner table, from a late-night conversation, from the quiet hours between the public moments. They spoke about him with a particular kind of tenderness. Not the tenderness of legend or nostalgia, but the tenderness you reserve for someone who is simply, genuinely, irreplaceably good. He had a way of making people feel like the most important person in the room, not because it was useful to him, not because he needed anything from them, but because that was how he moved through the world, curious, open, present in a way that famous people rarely are. Because fame has a way of building walls between a person and the ordinary human moments that make life feel real. Elvis tore those walls down, again and again, with every conversation he lingered in too long and every stranger he stopped to speak to, and every quiet act of generosity that happened without an audience, and therefore without a record. He was a man who felt things deeply and made no apology for it. He cried at music, he prayed without embarrassment. He talked about his mother with a grief so raw and unguarded that it made grown men look away out of respect for the intimacy of it. He was also, as a collection of handwritten notes locked away for decades would eventually reveal, a man who cared about his country in ways that went far beyond anything anyone expected of him. And that caring, it turned out, had taken him somewhere remarkable and left him carrying something heavy, long before the world had any idea. The operative who wrote those notes had kept them for years in personal storage. Not in any official archive, not in any system where they might be found and filed and stripped of their human texture. He kept them himself, in the particular way that people keep things they are not quite ready to release, but cannot bring themselves to destroy. When he finally made the decision to let them go, he explained why in a statement that was itself surprisingly plain and sincere for a man who had spent his career in the careful, guarded language of intelligence work. He believed, he said, that the public would eventually want to understand this chapter, that the full picture of Elvis Presley's life deserved to exist somewhere outside the locked room where it had been sitting, growing dusty and heavy with everything it contained. What investigators found when they opened those notes was not what most of them expected. The content was extraordinary, certainly. The private meetings, the named individuals, the patterns that overlapped with known intelligence concerns of the era. But what stopped many of them, what made them set the pages down for a moment before continuing, was the tone. The operative had liked Elvis. That much was clear in every line he wrote about him. Not in a sentimental or unprofessional way, but in the honest, unguarded way that happens when a person simply cannot help respecting what they see in front of them. He described Elvis as sincere. He used that word more than once, which in the clipped economy of intelligence writing is as close to warmth as the language allows. He wrote that Elvis appeared genuinely motivated, that his concerns were real, that the things he said in those private rooms, away from the cameras and the crowds and the careful machinery of his public image, matched the things he had quietly done throughout his life when no one was watching. That alignment between what a person says and what they do when there is nothing to gain is rarer than it should be. The operative had spent his career around people who made a profession of the gap between those two things. He recognized the absence of that gap in Elvis immediately, and he wrote it down. The release of those notes did something that no biography or documentary or retrospective had quite managed to do. It forced a genuine reconsideration. Historians and investigators who had spent years studying the Elvis Presley story found themselves returning to events they thought they understood and seeing them differently. Small things that had seemed like eccentricities now carried possible weight. Decisions that had seemed impulsive or contradictory now suggested a man navigating pressures and responsibilities that he had never been able to speak about openly. The shape of a life, when you add in the pieces that were missing, can change completely. The notes did not prove that Elvis had been a formal intelligence operative. The operative himself was careful never to claim that. What they proved was something more complicated and, in some ways, more interesting. That a relationship had existed. That Elvis had moved through a world that intersected in specific and documented ways with intelligence concerns of real national weight. That he had not stumbled into that intersection accidentally, but had, in some part, walked toward it deliberately, moved by the same force that had shaped everything else meaningful in his life. The simple, stubborn conviction that if you could help, you had an obligation to try. Investigators began cross-referencing the notes with other records from the same period. Documents that had existed in separate archives, that had never been placed beside the Elvis story because there had been no reason to place them there, began to look different when read alongside the operative's careful observations. Connections emerged, not conclusive ones. The gaps were still there, the silence is still large, but real ones. Real enough to change the conversation. And yet, for all that the notes revealed, what they withheld was equally striking. Certain sections referred to events that were never fully explained, conversations that were mentioned but not recorded in detail, names that appeared once and then vanished from the pages without resolution. The operative had either chosen not to commit certain things to writing, or there were other documents, other files, other notes, other records made by other hands in other rooms that contained what these pages left out. Investigators believe those documents may still exist, somewhere in the layered, slow-moving geography of classified archives and private collections and storage spaces that have not been opened in 30 or 40 years. There may be more. More conversations, more names, more of the story that has been waiting, patient and silent, for someone to come looking. That possibility is not a small thing. The notes that have already been released have done enough to alter the understanding of a man whose life seemed, on the surface, to have been entirely visible, entirely documented. One of the most photographed, recorded, written about human beings in the history of the modern world. And still, underneath all of that coverage, a room that almost no one had entered. What the operative's notes showed, above everything else, was that Elvis Presley had lived 2 lives simultaneously. One of them belonged to the world. The other he carried privately, quietly, with the same strength and the same sweetness and the same stubborn sense of duty that had defined him from the beginning. He had seen things. He had done things. He had cared deeply and at personal cost about a country that loved him for his music and never knew to love him for this. He was gone before anyone could ask him about it directly. Gone before the notes were released, before the cross-referencing began. Before investigators sat in quiet rooms and read the operative's careful words and understood, perhaps for the first time, the full weight of what that generous, watchful, endlessly feeling man had actually been carrying. The file may be closed, the assignment may be over, but the questions that remain open are not small ones, and they carry the particular, unresolvable ache of all the things that can never now be asked of the person who knew the answers. Somewhere in the archives, if the investigators are right, the rest of the story is still waiting. The only question is whether anyone will find it before time finishes the work that secrecy began.